The wind, a raw, scouring entity, shrieked across the boundless Dakota prairie, clawing at Ilara's thin shawl with icy talons. It threatened to rip baby Thomas from her grasp, a grasp already weakened by hunger and a bone-deep chill. Each gust carried splinters of sleet that stung her exposed cheeks, now numb and chapped to a painful crimson. The platform of the Redemption Whistle Stop station was a desolate strip of weathered planks, hemmed in by an ocean of snow-dusted grasses, vast and utterly indifferent to her plight. The train that had belched her and her meager hopes onto this forsaken spot hours ago was a distant memory, its plume of smoke long devoured by the bruised, turbulent sky of late afternoon. He wasn't coming. The realization, a certainty she had fought for hours, had finally settled in her marrow, cold and heavy as the iron rails stretching endlessly into the encroaching gloom. Mr. Alistair Finch. The name, once a beacon, now tasted like ash in her mouth. His neatly penned letters, filled with promises of a respectable home, a new life for her and Thomas in a land of opportunity, had been lies. Or perhaps he was dead, or had simply changed his mind. The result was the same. She was alone. Thomas whimpered, a small, distressed sound muffled against her collarbone. His tiny body, bundled in every layer Ilara possessed, her own patched underskirt, a flannel remnant, his thin receiving blanket, still trembled violently. "Shh, my love," she whispered, her voice a ragged exhalation against his downy hair. "Hush now, my brave boy." But the baby, sensing her rising tide of fear, her despair, began to wail, a thin, piercing cry that the wind snatched and flung across the empty plains, a sound swallowed by the immensity of the wilderness. Her portmanteau, a battered cardboard thing reinforced with leather straps, sat beside her like a forgotten tombstone. Inside, a handful of precious, clean diapers, a dwindling supply of dried milk for Thomas, should her own inadequate supply fail entirely, her deceased mother's tarnished silver locket, and the letters. Those damnable, hopeful letters. She'd read them countless times on the chugging, days-long journey west, tracing the elegant script that spoke of a comfortable sod house, acres ready for planting, and a yearning for gentle companionship, all lies. The station agent, a man whose face seemed carved from frost-bitten wood, with eyes like chips of flint, had barely looked up from his ledger. He'd grunted that Finch lived a good 2 hours' ride north, if he ain't up and died or run off, which them loner types are prone to do. He'd offered no warmth, no advice beyond a curt nod towards the featureless northern horizon before retreating into his small, lamp-lit office. The door had closed with a thud of absolute finality, the scrape of a bolt echoing her abandonment. She'd knocked again, a polite, then a more urgent rap, but only the howling wind answered. Darkness was encroaching, not a gentle fade but a swift, consuming blanket rolling in from the east, bringing with it an even more vicious bite to the air. The temperature plummeted. Ilara huddled against the rough, unpainted wall of the station building, trying to shield Thomas from the worst of the wind. Her milk was scant, her body depleted from the arduous, swaying journey, the stale food, and the gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion since leaving behind the judgmental eyes of her small Pennsylvania town. Thomas's cries grew weaker, morphing into fretful, gasping whimpers that tore at her soul. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, pricked at the edges of her fraying resolve. She had come so far, endured the whispers about her condition, the sidelong glances, the quiet ostracization that came with being an unwed mother in a world that had no designated place for such women. The advertisement for a mail-order bride, a wife for a homesteader in the Montana Territory, tucked away in the back pages of a discarded newspaper, had seemed like a lifeline, a desperate gamble for a future. Any future for her son. Now, it felt like a fool's errand, a cruel, elaborate joke played by a heartless fate. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the clasp of her portmanteau. She pulled out her thickest woolen scarf, the one her mother had knitted, its familiar, scratchy texture a small, painful reminder of a lost warmth. She wrapped it again around Thomas, creating a tighter cocoon, then draped the ends over her own head, trying to fashion a small pocket of shared, desperate warmth. Every fiber of her being screamed for shelter, for a crackling fire, for a human voice that wasn't her own fractured whisper. But there was nothing. Only the wind, the driving sleet, and the suffocating, predatory night. She thought of her mother, dead these 2 long years from consumption, whose gentle face and unwavering belief in Ilara had always been a beacon. "You're stronger than you think, Ellie girl," she'd said, her voice thin as paper near the end. Ilara closed her eyes, fighting back tears that would only freeze on her cheeks and offer no comfort. Giving up was not an option. Thomas, her son. He was her world, her responsibility, her only reason. She had to find something, anything. With a grunt of effort, fueled by a primal maternal instinct, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs stiff and aching, threatening to buckle. The portmanteau was a dead weight. She looped its handle over one arm. Thomas clutched fiercely, possessively, in the other. The station agent's window remained a dark, unforgiving square. No help there. He'd probably be warm by his stove, sipping coffee, indifferent. There was a faint, almost imperceptible track leading away from the station, barely visible under the swirling snow. North, he'd said. It was a direction, a sliver of purpose in the overwhelming emptiness. Better than freezing where she stood, becoming another forgotten tragedy of the frontier. Each step was an agony. The wind pushed against her, a malevolent, sentient force determined to drive her back or down. The snow crunched under her worn, thin-soled boots, the sound loud in the oppressive silence between Thomas's weakening, shallow gasps. The darkness was almost complete now, the landscape a series of menacing, indistinct shapes that her tired mind twisted into lurking beasts or gaping crevasses. Her hope, a tiny, sputtering ember moments ago, was threatening to be snuffed out entirely. "Please," she mouthed to the empty, uncaring sky, the words stolen by the wind before it could form. "Please, someone, anyone." She didn't know how long she'd walked, a stumbling, desperate pilgrimage into the teeth of the frozen night. An hour, 2. Time had lost all meaning, subsumed by the rhythm of her ragged breaths, the burn in her lungs, and Thomas's increasingly faint, shallow whimpers. Her world had shrunk to the next agonizing step, the searing pain in her frozen feet, the leaden weight of her child, whose stillness now terrified her more than his cries. Just when she thought she could go no further, that she would simply sink into a snowdrift and let the cold, mercifully, take them both, a pinprick of light wavered in the vast, inky distance. Hope, fragile and almost unbelievable, surged through her weary body, a jolt like a forgotten heartbeat. It was faint, almost lost in the swirling snow that plastered her face and clothes, but it was undeniably there. A light meant shelter, it meant fire, it meant life. Summoning a reserve of strength she hadn't known she possessed, a primal fire ignited by the sight, Ilara forced her frozen legs onward. Each step was a fresh torment, but the light, a tiny beacon in the crushing darkness, pulled her forward. It grew, ever so slowly, resolving itself into the mellow, steady glow of a lamp in a window. A dark, solid shape loomed behind it, a cabin, small and low-set against the drifts, with smoke, blessedly, uncurling from its chimney like a whispered prayer. As she drew closer, limbs screaming in protest, a dog began to bark, a deep, resonant sound that was both terrifying in its suddenness and, perversely, reassuring. A dog meant people. A door, a dark rectangle in the cabin wall, creaked open, spilling a narrow rectangle of warmer, inviting light onto the snow-covered ground. A figure, tall and broad-shouldered, filled the doorway, a rifle held loosely but purposefully in one hand. Elara stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could barely make out his features in the gloom, only his imposing silhouette against the light. "Hello?" she called out, her voice thin, cracking, barely audible above the wind's mournful song. "Please, help us. My baby. He's so cold." The figure didn't move for a long, agonizing moment. The dog, somewhere behind him, continued its agitated, ferocious barking. Elara clutched Thomas tighter, a shield against the unknown. Then a gruff voice cut through the wind, deep and resonant. "Who's out there? State your business." "My name is Elara. Elara Vance." The words tumbled out, a desperate, breathless plea. I was supposed to be met at the redemption station. My baby, he's so cold. Please, we need shelter." Silence again, stretching her nerves taut as a bowstring. Then, slowly, the man stepped forward from the doorway, the rifle still in hand but now pointed towards the ground. He moved with a cautious, deliberate gait. In his other hand, he now held aloft a tin lantern, its flickering light illuminating a face weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines of hardship, framed by a dark, untrimmed beard and thick, unruly hair. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed under a heavy brow, were assessing, wary and startlingly blue in the lamplight. He looked from her chapped, desperate face to the bundled, still form in her arms, his gaze lingering on Thomas. Elara could see the flicker of something in those keen eyes. Surprise, certainly, but also a deep, ingrained suspicion. This was a land where strangers were often trouble. "Finch?" he asked, his voice low, roughened by disuse or the cold. "You looking for Alistair Finch's place?" Elara shook her head, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. The name was a bitter reminder. He wasn't there. He didn't come. The man grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. He looked back at his cabin, a bastion of warmth in the frigid hellscape, then at her, a frozen supplicant. The wind howled, whipping snow around them in a frenzy. Thomas let out a tiny, exhausted cough, a sound so frail it seemed to pierce the man's reserve. That small, pathetic sound seemed to be the deciding factor. He sighed, a plume of white breath in the frigid air. "Get inside," he said, his voice devoid of perceptible warmth but not entirely unkind, "before you both freeze solid on my doorstep." He stepped aside, holding the door wider. The dog, a large, shaggy creature with intelligent eyes, growled low in its chest but fell silent at a sharp, guttural word from the man. The wave of warmth that washed over Elara as she stumbled across the threshold was a dizzying, almost painful sensation after the hours in the biting cold. It smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, damp wool, and something indefinably masculine, of solitude. The interior was small, even smaller than she'd imagined, but meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful fire crackling and spitting within, its light dancing on the rough-hewn log walls. A sturdy table and two simple chairs stood in the center of the packed earth floor. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall. A larger, quilt-covered bed occupied another corner. Pots and pans hung neatly from pegs. "Sit," He gestured with his chin towards the chair closest to the fire. Ilara sank onto it, her legs trembling so violently she could barely control them. With fumbling, numb fingers, she began to unwrap Thomas's outer layers. His skin, when she finally touched his cheek, was terrifyingly cold, his tiny lips tinged with a faint blue. Fear, sharp and visceral, lanced through her. The man watched her, his expression unreadable, shadowed. He put the rifle carefully onto a set of wooden pegs by the door and moved to the cast-iron stove, where a kettle steamed gently. He poured dark, fragrant liquid into a chipped enamel mug. He brought it to her. Coffee, hot and strong, drink it. Ilara took it with shaking hands, the intense warmth seeping into her frozen fingers, then her palms. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat tight. He nodded curtly, then ladled water from a bucket on a stand into a tin basin, setting it on the edge of the stove to heat. "For the babe," he said, not looking at her. "Get him warm." His name, she learned later, not that first night but gradually, was Josiah Brandt. He was a man of exceedingly few words, his movements economical and purposeful, his presence filling the small cabin without being oppressive. He didn't ask many questions that first night, for which Ilara was profoundly grateful. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the pendulum swing from despair to fragile safety, to recount her foolish hopes and bitter disappointments. He helped her bathe Thomas in the basin of warm water, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he tested the temperature, his brow furrowed with a seriousness that was almost tender. He found an old, soft flannel shirt in a wooden chest, one that smelled faintly of cedar, and without a word, tore it into strips for makeshift diapers when Ilara confessed, her face burning with shame, that her own supply was sodden and nearly gone. He watched, a silent, brooding sentinel, as she finally managed to coax a little warm, diluted cow's milk from his own meager winter supply. She realized later, into Thomas using her finger and a clean rag. When Thomas, his skin slowly regaining a healthier pink, was finally asleep, wrapped in a dry piece of blanket Josiah provided and tucked into a hastily fashioned nest of sacks near the hearth, Josiah gestured to the larger bed. "You take that. I'll use the cot." "No, I couldn't," Ilara began, mortified at the thought of displacing him. "The chair is fine." He cut her off with a gruff, "Don't be foolish, woman. You need proper rest, for the boy." There was no arguing with the quiet, implacable authority in his voice. Exhaustion, a heavy, irresistible tide, pulled at her. She murmured her thanks, a wave of dizziness sweeping over her. After checking on Thomas one last anxious time, she collapsed onto the surprisingly comfortable mattress, pulling the thick, heavy quilt over herself. Its scent was clean, of soap and wood smoke. She was asleep before she could truly register the monumental strangeness of it all. A stranger's cabin, a stranger's bed, a stranger who had, for this night at least, saved them from the merciless wild. The following days fell into a quiet, almost monastic routine. The blizzard that had driven Ilara to Josiah's doorstep raged for 2 more full days, imprisoning them within the small, fire-lit cabin, the wind howling outside like a frustrated beast. Josiah tended his few animals, a hardy milk cow, a half-dozen chickens, and his sturdy gelding, in the attached lean-to, chopped wood with powerful rhythmic swings of his axe, and mostly kept to himself, mending tack with practiced hands or reading a well-thumbed, leather-bound Bible by the flickering firelight. Ilara, her strength slowly returning, cared for Thomas, cooked their simple meals from Josiah's stores of flour, beans, and salted pork, and tried to make herself useful, mending his worn work shirts with the small sewing kit from her portmanteau, her stitches neat and even. The silence between them was vast, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind, or Thomas's occasional gurgles. Yet, it was not entirely uncomfortable. It was a silence of observation, of unspoken questions, of two solitary souls warily circling each other. Ilara found herself watching Josiah when he wasn't looking. His hands, capable and strong, whether splitting logs with brutal efficiency or gentling his nervous mare in the lean-to. The way his brow furrowed in concentration over the dense passages of his Bible. The rare fleeting moments when his stern, almost forbidding expression softened as he looked at Thomas, a flicker of something unutterably wistful, almost painful, in his deep-set eyes. She learned, not from him directly but from a small, faded tin-type photograph propped on the rough mantelpiece, that he had likely lost a family. It showed a woman with a gentle, shy smile and dark hair pulled back neatly, and a small girl with bright, curious eyes and pigtails, clutching a rag doll. Josiah never mentioned them, never looked at the photo when Ilara was near, but its silent testimony spoke volumes. It explained the profound emptiness she sometimes sensed in his gaze, the solitude he seemed to wrap around himself like a protective cloak. Ilara, in turn, spoke little of her own past, of Mr. Finch, or the circumstances that had driven her to such a desperate measure as mail-order bribery. The shame was still too raw, the disappointment too keen, but Josiah didn't press. He seemed to accept her presence, and that of Thomas, as an unforeseen fact, like the unexpected depth of the snow or the prolonged fierceness of the wind. One afternoon, as the storm finally began to show signs of abating, its fury lessening to a mournful sigh, Thomas developed a fretful, barking cough. His small body grew hot and listless in her arms. Ilara's fear, which had receded to a dull ache, returned with sharp, debilitating force. This was how it started with her younger sister, the cough that stole her breath, then her life. Josiah, seeing her white-faced distress, the panic in her eyes as she rocked the feverish baby, was surprisingly resourceful. He searched through a small wooden box of dried herbs, his brow furrowed. He brewed a pungent tea from willow bark and another plant she didn't recognize, its scent filling the cabin. With infinite patience, he helped Ilara coax the warm, bitter liquid into Thomas spoonful by spoonful. He sat with Ilara through the long, anxious night, taking turns to hold the restless baby, his quiet, solid presence a steadying force in the dimly lit cabin. He even hummed a low, tuneless melody, something rough and ancient that seemed to soothe Thomas when her own frantic whispers failed. By morning, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas's fever had broken. He was weak, pale, but his breathing was easier, the terrible heat gone from his skin. Ilara, exhausted but awash with a profound, bone-deep relief, looked at Josiah over Thomas's sleeping head, her eyes filled with a gratitude too profound for words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. You saved him." He merely grunted, turning away to stir the fire, but there was a distinct softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a lessening of the harsh guard he kept. "Boy's a fighter," he said, his back still to her. He hesitated, then added, his voice even gruffer, "Like his mother, I reckon." The words, simple and unadorned, resonated deep within Ilara. It was the first time anyone, in a very long time, had acknowledged her strength, her struggle, without judgment. A fragile warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, a warmth that felt dangerously like hope. When the skies finally cleared a day later, revealing a world blanketed in pristine, dazzling white under a pale sun, the question of her departure hung unspoken, heavy and unavoidable in the air. The town of Redemption, the nearest settlement, was a day's ride away, Josiah had said. She had no money, no prospects, nowhere to go. The thought of returning to the uncertainty, the cold indifference of the world beyond this small, isolated cabin, was terrifying. Josiah broke the silence one morning, as he was pulling on his heavy winter boots, the lean-to already echoing with the cow's impatient lowing. Weather's cleared for good, looks like. Road to redemption will be passable in a day or so, once the drifts settle. Ilara's heart sank like a stone. She nodded, busying herself with tidying the already tidy cabin, unable to meet his gaze. I suppose I should make arrangements to leave then. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Brandt. We are deeply indebted to you. He finished lacing his boots, then straightened, looking at her directly, his expression thoughtful, unreadable. Finch, you still set on finding him, or heading back east? She thought of Mr. Alistair Finch, the man who had lured her across a continent only to abandon her without a second thought. The memory brought a surge of cold anger, not the despair she'd felt on the station platform. That anger felt cleaner somehow. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm, meeting his gaze. There's nothing for me with him, and going back, there's nothing for us there either. Josiah nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he already suspected. He picked up his worn fur hat, turning it over and over in his large hands. This is no place for a woman alone with a babe, especially with winter still holding on. It's hard country. I know, Ilara said quietly, her gaze dropping to Thomas, who was gurgling happily in his makeshift cradle near the hearth, batting at a piece of string she dangled for him. But I have to try. We have to survive. He was silent for a long moment, studying her, his blue eyes narrowed in thought. Then he said, his voice gruff, almost reluctant, as if the words were being dragged from him. No call to rush off into the snow just yet. Place is small, but it's warm enough. And the boy, he needs proper looking after, regular food. He cleared his throat, a rough sound. You can stay, for a while longer, help out with the chores. Lord knows I'm behind on things, until you figure what's next, or spring comes proper. Ilara looked up, stunned into silence. His gaze was direct, holding hers, unwavering. It wasn't a declaration of affection, or even friendship. It was a practical offer, matter of fact, born of, what? Pity, a grudging sense of duty, or perhaps something more, something he himself didn't fully understand or wouldn't name. Are you sure, Mr. Brandt? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid to believe it. We would not wish to be a burden. Could use an extra pair of hands, truth be told, he said, looking away towards the window, as if the view of the snow-covered yard was suddenly fascinating. Can get more done before spring planting. Woman's touch about the place wouldn't go amiss either, and it ain't right for a child to be out in this weather without good cause. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, hot and sudden, tears of overwhelming relief, of a gratitude so immense it ached in her chest. Thank you, Josiah, she said, her voice trembling. For the first time, she used his given name without the formal Mr. It felt right. We won't be a burden. I'll work hard. He just grunted again. That characteristic sound that Ilara was beginning to understand hid a depth of feeling he rarely, if ever, expressed. He jammed his hat on his head and headed out to tend the animals, leaving Ilara standing by the fire, a tentative, fragile blossom of hope unfurling in the desolate, frozen landscape of her heart. Spring arrived hesitantly across the Dakota plains, a slow, reluctant thawing that mirrored the equally tentative easing of restraint and silence within the small log cabin. The vast, oppressive whiteness of winter gradually gave way to muddy browns, then to patches of stubborn, vivid green as the prairie grasses awakened. Ilara, with Thomas often strapped to her back in a sling Josiah fashioned from a worn blanket, or sleeping soundly in a sturdy basket he'd woven from willow branches, threw herself into the demanding work of the farm with a fervor born of gratitude and a desperate need to prove her worth. She learned to milk the recalcitrant dun cow, Bess, who had a habit of kicking if approached too suddenly, to scatter feed for the clucking, greedy chickens, and to plant a small but ambitious vegetable garden near the cabin with precious seeds Josiah had carefully saved from previous years. Her hands, once soft and unaccustomed to labor, became chapped, then calloused and capable. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, her frame grew stronger, and a quiet, resilient strength settled in her eyes, replacing the hunted look she'd worn upon arrival. Josiah, for his part, unbent in small, almost imperceptible ways like a frozen river slowly thawing under the spring sun. He started on occasion, leaving a single wildflower, a sprig of pale prairie crocus, a shy bluebell, or a vibrant Indian paintbrush, on the rough-hewn table in the mornings, a silent offering she'd find when she rose to start the breakfast. He carved a small, remarkably detailed wooden bird for Thomas, its wings slightly spread as if in mid-flight, and Ilara had seen him watching, a rare, almost tender smile touching his lips, as Thomas gummed it happily. He even, on very rare occasions, offered a dry, understated comment about the weather or the stubbornness of a particular fence post that, if one listened carefully, might have passed for a jest. He never spoke directly of his past wife or daughter, whose tintype still held its silent vigil on the mantelpiece, nor did Ilara press him about her own history. But a quiet understanding, a comfort in shared silences and the rhythm of mutual labor, grew steadily between them. They were two solitary trees, scarred by storms, their branches now tentatively intertwining. Their tentative peace, the fragile domesticity they were slowly building, was shattered one crisp, sun-drenched afternoon in late May. Ilara was hanging freshly washed laundry on the line Josiah had strung between two cottonwood saplings, the clean scent of lye soap and sun-warmed cotton a small, satisfying comfort. Thomas, now a sturdy crawler, was exploring a patch of new clover at her feet, his happy gurgles a constant melody. It was then she saw a rider approaching from the direction of Redemption. It wasn't Josiah who was out mending fences on the far western pasture, a full day's task. This man was unfamiliar, dressed in dark, somewhat flashy city clothes that looked conspicuously out of place against the rugged, wide-open landscape. A knot of old, familiar unease tightened in her stomach. Strangers, in her experience, rarely brought good news. He reined in his sleek bay horse near the cabin, his gaze sweeping over her with an appraising, insolent quality that made her skin crawl. He was a stout man, perhaps in his late 40s, with a florid, jowly face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Well now, what have we here?" he said, his voice oily and overloud in the quiet afternoon. Quite the charming picture of domestic bliss. Didn't know Brant had taken himself a wife. Ilara stood her ground, though her heart had begun a nervous flutter. Her hand instinctively went to Thomas, who, startled by the strange voice, had stopped his play and looked up with wide eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice as steady as she could make it despite the tremor of fear that snaked down her spine. "I'm looking for Josiah Brant," the man said, dismounting with a grunt of effort. He hitched his horse to the rail Josiah had recently repaired. "Name's Silas Blackwood, from Redemption. Got some pressing business with him." "He's not here right now," Ilara replied, trying to keep her tone neutral, betraying none of her apprehension. He's working the west pasture. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, taking in her worn but clean dress, the way she instinctively shielded the child. And who might you be, Missy? Don't recall Brant mentioning any family. The way he said family was laced with insinuation, a clear insult. I'm Ilara Vance. I'm helping Mr. B. sits to a Brant with the farm, Ilara said, lifting her chin a fraction, refusing to be intimidated. Blackwood chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. Helping him, are you? Is that what they call it these days? I heard he'd taken in some stray off the train. Didn't realize strays came with baggage. He gestured dismissively with a flick of his riding crop towards Thomas, who, sensing the tension, began to whimper. Ilara's temper, long dormant under layers of fear and hardship, flared with surprising heat. My son is not baggage, Mr. Blackwood. And we are not strays. We are guests of Mr. Brant. Temper, Blackwood sneered, though a flicker of surprise crossed his face at her spirit. No matter to me what you call yourselves. My business is with Brant. He owes me money, quite a considerable sum as it happens, and his time for repayment is long up. He took a step closer, his bulk seeming to loom over her. Perhaps you can persuade him to be cooperative when he returns. Unless, of course, you fancy being out on your own again. Word is, you arrived in redemption with nothing but the clothes on your back and that crying babe. Fear, cold and horribly familiar, clawed at Ilara's throat. She thought of the endless, indifferent prairie, the biting wind of that first night, the gnawing hunger. She wouldn't go back to that. Not now. Not when she'd found a sliver of safety, of acceptance, of something that felt almost like hope. Before she could formulate a reply, Josiah's voice, hard as prairie granite, cut through the air. Blackwood. Josiah rode up on his gelding, seemingly appearing from nowhere, his face grim, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, fixed on the unwelcome intruder. He dismounted in one fluid movement, his worn work clothes and dusty boots a stark contrast to Blackwood's city attire, yet radiating an authority Blackwood's finery lacked. His gaze flickered to Ilara and Thomas, a quick, almost imperceptible glance that nonetheless conveyed reassurance before returning hard and challenging to Blackwood. What do you want here? Josiah asked, his voice low and devoid of any welcome. Evening, Brant, Blackwood said, his false joviality not quite masking a newfound unease now that he faced Josiah directly. Just came to collect what's owed. The note's past due, as you well know. 2 bad harvests in a row, Brant. I can't afford to carry you forever. Josiah's jaw tightened. Ilara knew he'd been worried about his debts, accrued after a hailstorm had wiped out one crop and a drought had withered the next. He'd been counting on a good crop this year to finally settle things. I need more time, Blackwood. The crop's just in the ground. It looks promising this year. Rain's been timely. Time's money, Brant, and my patience, she's run out. Blackwood's gaze slid towards Ilara again, a leering quality to it. Unless you got something else of value to offer. Heard you've got yourself a nice little housekeeper now. Pretty thing, too. Perhaps she could work off some of that debt for you in town, at the saloon. They're always looking for fresh faces. His smirk was vile, his meaning unmistakable. A low growl rumbled in Josiah's chest, a dangerous sound. He took a menacing step forward, his large hands clenched into fists at his sides. You'll leave her out of this, Blackwood. This is between you and me. Is it now? Blackwood taunted, emboldened by what he perceived as Josiah's vulnerability. Looks to me like she's very much in this, living in your house, eating your food, warming your bed for all I know. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. But before Josiah, whose face was now a thundercloud of restrained fury, could react violently, she stepped forward, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of protective anger. She placed a hand on his rigid arm. His muscles were coiled tight as steel springs beneath her touch. "Mr. Blackwood," Elara said, her voice surprisingly calm and clear, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Brant is an honorable man. He will pay his debts when the harvest comes in. But you will not speak to me, or about my son, or about Mr. Brant's affairs in that despicable manner again. You will show some respect in this home." Blackwood looked genuinely taken aback by her directness, by the quiet fire in her eyes. Josiah himself stared at her, a flicker of profound surprise, then something akin to fierce pride, transforming his harsh features. "Is that so?" Blackwood sneered, recovering his composure, though some of his bluster had faded. "And who in tarnation are you to tell me anything, girl? You're nothing, a charity case, a fallen woman he took in out of pity." "She's more woman than you'll ever know a day in your miserable life, Blackwood," Josiah said, his voice dangerously quiet, his arm protectively around Elara's shoulder now. "And she's right. I'll pay what I owe, but not today. You'll give me till after the harvest is in, or you'll get nothing at all from me but trouble." It was a gamble, a bold one. Blackwood knew that if he pushed too hard, tried to seize the farm before the harvest, he'd get little for his trouble beyond barren land and a few meager possessions. The land was only valuable if it produced, and Josiah was the one who made it produce. Blackwood studied Josiah's unyielding stance, then Elara's unexpected defiance. He saw the set of Josiah's jaw, the unwavering support in Elara's eyes. He saw Thomas, now peering curiously from behind Elara's skirts, a symbol of something new, something rooted and fiercely protected, on this small, struggling farm. He spat contemptuously on the ground. "After the harvest, Brant, not a day later, and if the crop fails." He let the threat hang in the air, heavy and unpleasant. He heaved himself back onto his horse, gave Elara one last lingering, contemptuous look, and rode away, a dark, unwelcome stain on the bright promise of the afternoon. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets and Thomas's soft sigh. Elara's legs felt weak, the adrenaline leaving her shaky. Josiah turned to her, his expression softening as he looked down at her, his hand still on her shoulder. "Are you all right, Elara?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment, simply leaning into his steadying presence. He reached out then, his callous thumb gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. It was a gesture so unexpected, so tender, it made her breath catch in her throat. "He won't bother you again," Josiah said, his gaze fierce as he looked in the direction Blackwood had gone. "I won't let him." "I know," she whispered, and she did, in that moment standing beside him, having faced down a common threat together. Something profound shifted between them. The tentative, unspoken bonds that had been forming over weeks of shared labor and quiet companionship solidified, tempered and strengthened by adversity, like steel in a forge. That evening, after Thomas was asleep in his basket, his little wooden bird clutched in his hand, they sat by the fire, the silence no longer vast or awkward, but comfortable, companionable. The lamp cast a warm glow over the cabin. "Thank you," Josiah said quietly, not looking at her but into the dancing flames, "for what you said to Blackwood, for standing with me." Elara smiled faintly, tracing the pattern on the worn quilt she was mending. "He needed to be told, and this is our home." He was disrespecting it. Us. Josiah looked at her then, a long, searching gaze that seemed to reach into her very soul. You're good for this place, Elara. Good for me. The admission seemed to cost him, yet it was said with a deep sincerity. It was empty here for too long. And you for us, Josiah, she replied softly, meeting his gaze without flinching. You gave us a home, shelter from the storm, when we had nothing and no one. He reached across the small space separating their chairs and took her hand. His grip was warm, strong, encompassing. This is your home now, Elara, yours and the boys, for as long as you'll have it, if you'll have it. It wasn't a proposal in the conventional sense, not flowery or romantic. It was better. It was a promise, solid and real as the earth beneath their feet, a commitment. A new beginning, wrested from hardship, loneliness, and fear. Elara's fingers curled around his, returning the firm pressure. Yes, Josiah, she said, her voice filled with an emotion she hadn't dared to feel for a very long time, a deep, abiding hope, and something that felt remarkably, wonderfully, like love. Yes, we'll have it. The harvest that year, fueled by timely rains and the tireless labor of two people working as one, was bountiful, the best Josiah had seen in years. Together, they brought in the corn and wheat, stacked the hay, and stored vegetables from Elara's thriving garden in the root cellar. When Josiah, with Elara proudly beside him, paid off Silas Blackwood in full in the general store in redemption, the moneylender's surprise was almost comical. His subsequent attempts at civility met with cool dignity. The small cabin, once a lonely refuge from the biting cold, became a true home, filled with the everyday sounds of a growing family. Thomas's delighted squeals as Josiah swung him high, his first halting words, the scent of Elara's baking bread mingling with the aroma of coffee, and the quiet, contented rhythm of two lives purposefully intertwined. The Dakota prairie was still vast, its beauty often harsh, the winters still long and challenging. But Elara Vance Brant, no longer alone, no longer desolate, faced it not with fear, but with a resilient heart, a steadfast, loving companion by her side, and a son whose future, once so terribly precarious, now stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility under the wide, cerulean Montana sky. She had come west seeking mere shelter, a desperate escape, and had found instead a life, a love, and a belonging, built not on the fragile paper of neat promises in a stranger's letter, but on the solid bedrock of shared hardship, quiet courage, and the unexpected, tenacious blooming of love in the unlikeliest of frontier soil. The journey from desperation to belonging is often paved with unexpected kindness and the courage to trust again. Elara and Josiah's story reminds us that even in the harshest winters of life, warmth and new beginnings can be found. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And never forget there's no expiration date on hope.